Hello, welcome to Liberty Wolf. My name is Zach Strong. I am the creator and host of this podcast. Welcome to all the newcomers. I hope that you will go check out the former 9 editions of this podcast to get caught up. And if you like my work, if you like my analysis, I invite you and encourage you to subscribe and follow me for more. I also encourage everyone who appreciates what I do to spread the word by sharing this podcast on your social media platforms or wherever. Now, today is the 10th episode of Liberty Wolf. So I was thinking of what topic to do. So I was thinking of something dealing with the number 10. And so I got a good idea. I think this is going to be a very fun podcast. There's an old saying that you may have heard. It goes something like this: that everyone needs to know the 3 tens. The 10 Commandments, the first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, and the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. If you think about that, that really is true. Everyone, no matter where they are, they need to understand the principles in these 3 sets of tens. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to devote 3 segments, essentially a segment each, to each of these sets of tens. Of course, the foundational set of 10 would be the 10 Commandments. So that's what I will tackle first. Now, sometimes people look at the 10 Commandments as, they're old. They're thousands of years old. They were revealed in the Old Testament, not even in the New Testament, the Old Testament of the Bible. What do we really need them for anyway? Do they really apply to us? I mean, they were given to Moses. Didn't Christ do away with the law of Moses? I mean, what's so special about the 10 Commandments? Well, the 10 Commandments actually are still in effect today. We are still accountable for our conduct in relation to those principles revealed by God through one of his prophets, Moses, to mankind. There's a little book that I have called The 10 Commandments Today, a discussion on the Decalogue. It was published by the Deseret Book Company back in 1955. Each chapter is written by a different author. And in the introduction, it says this about the 10 Commandments. Quote, "The 10 Commandments were written by the finger of God on tables of stone, and given to the children of Israel and to all people, for all time, for their guidance. The children of Israel, to whom the 10 Commandments were given, were a choice people, stiff-necked to be sure, and often childlike in their actions, but a special people, a holy nation of priests, and with a great mission and promise. The commandments were direct, specific, and understandable. They were not evolved over eons of time. They are not a collection of don'ts given to hedge about the freedom of a superstitious people. How is it that these laws have never been brought into question? How is it that through the centuries, the teachings of the Decalogue stand before us today fresh and beautiful? The very words seem to carry their own credentials. No one will ever outgrow them, for they are the revelations of God. They bear witness that God does not leave his children alone to grope, falter, and guess about the saving principles of conduct in this life. They are not man's concepts of what is right, but the mind, will, and heart of a gracious Father who loves his children and yearns for their welfare. They must be taught to and learned by the children of men if they would live happy and fruitful lives." Close quote. The 10 Commandments were revelations, or it was a revelation. Came as a pack, I assume. The 10 Commandments were given to mankind through Moses. Just because they were given to the Israelites in the ancient days does not mean they were only applicable to the tribes of Israel. They're applicable to all of us because we're all God's children. Even the lowliest person on earth, the most deranged, psychotic, or evil person on earth is still a son or daughter of God. That's one of the great truths. And my 3rd book that is coming out, hopefully in the next few weeks, it discusses this truth of man's true origin and our parent-child relationship with deity, our Father. Now, the 10 Commandments were given by God to us, and so it probably behooves us to understand a little bit about what it says. So I figured, what better way than to know them than to actually read them. So I turned to the book of Exodus, chapter 20 in the Old Testament. And I'm just going to read the Ten Commandments and the kind of explanations that go along with some of them. This is the Lord speaking. He says, quote, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. Thou shalt not bow thyself down to them, nor serve them. For I the Lord am God, or for I the Lord thy God am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and shewing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's." Close quote. So those are the Ten Commandments. Probably the most important, of course, is to have no other gods before the true God, who is our Father, and his Son, Jesus Christ. The Savior, when he lived upon the earth, he taught the same principle, that to love God with all of our heart, might, mind, and strength is the great law. And then the second one is like unto it, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves. So the Ten Commandments we see, they encompass virtually every aspect of human life, of relationships. It talks about parent-child relationships. Honor thy father, honor thy mother. Thou shalt not kill, so don't kill other people. Don't violate that right. Don't steal their stuff. Don't take away someone's virtue and chastity through adultery and fornication. Don't covet. Don't be a horrible person, basically. Be a good person. Be humble. Serve God. Don't serve other false gods. Don't work on the Sabbath day. So all of these sorts of things, they're not archaic rules that applied to a time in Earth's past. These are applicable to us today, and that's really the challenge of the Ten Commandments, is to find how they apply to us today in our circumstances, because circumstances have changed. However, human nature has not. And so when the Lord revealed these commandments to ancient peoples, well, he was also speaking to us, because we all come from the same source. We are all children of God. Human nature does not change. It's the same, and always will be. And so these commandments regulate our actions, or they should if we live according to them. Now, that provides, of course, the foundation for society, for civilization, for civil relationships between each other. Our country, the United States of America, was founded upon the principles of the Ten Commandments and the Bible. That's a fact, and I don't care how many atheists or progressives and others try to dispute that. That's a fact. Our founding fathers were Christians. Thomas Jefferson, for example, often called an atheist, he said, quote, "I am a real Christian, that is to say, a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus." Close quote. And he said it multiple times. He read the Bible. George Washington also. He talked about God constantly. He read the Bible and went to church, had a pew reserved in his local church for him. You just go down the list. A lot of them had theological degrees. These were very learned men, yes, but they were also very studied and learned in the law of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Word count studies have shown that the Founding Fathers actually quoted more from the Bible than from any other source. They didn't quote more from the Romans, they didn't quote more from the British or the French or any other group of thinkers or whatever. They quoted from the Bible more often than any other source. So this is where they took their philosophy. And then this philosophy is what went into, of course, the founding of this country through our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, which openly declares a belief in God and a reliance on Him, and then the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is actually kind of like the bookend of the second half of the Declaration of Independence. One without the other is pointless. They both go together. They have to be read together. And so the Declaration of Independence is almost like the preamble of the Constitution. I know the Constitution does have a preamble, but, you know, in the broader sense, the Declaration is almost like a preamble and introduction to the Constitution. And so we see that there's a heavy reliance upon God, upon the things of the Bible. I mean, even the commandment that to keep the Sabbath day holy is preserved in the U.S. Constitution. The government's not supposed to operate on Sunday. Now, which other religions have their holy day on Sunday? Well, not Islam, not Judaism, you know. And so, I mean, you have to really go out of your way to deny the facts if you try to say this country was not founded on religious principles. It was. Now, I want to move on to the second set of 10s, which is, of course, the first 10 amendments and the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. First 10 amendments. These amendments are inspired pieces of work. They really are. Originally, the Founding Fathers were not going to include a Bill of Rights. However, there were a few individuals that pressed heavily for it. Thomas Jefferson was one. He had a lot of influence with his best friend, James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution. They wrote back and forth prolifically. Jefferson, that's what he said when he first read the draft of the Constitution. Remember, Jefferson was in France at the time, and his best friend, Madison, was kind of leading the Constitutional Convention. He was the spearhead. And so anyway, when Madison sent Jefferson a draft of the Constitution, Jefferson talked about how wonderful it is. He said there are a few things that he might change himself, but essentially he said it's absolutely wonderful. It's the best document ever created to govern a nation. And he said the only thing I would add, and he was really insistent, he said the people deserve it. They deserve a Bill of Rights that are very specific. Because even though people already knew him, he wanted it spelled out in plain English. You know, a bunch of thou shalt nots to the government. Thou shalt not infringe upon our free speech, for example. Thou shalt not steal our guns. So he wanted that, and he pushed heavily for it. James Madison favored it, and others finally came around. They ended up writing the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And so these 10, I want to, like I did with the 10 Commandments, I want to read them. Some people might not have ever heard them before in their entirety. So, without further ado, here are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Amendment number 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Amendment number 2. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Amendment number 3. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Amendment 4, which was often considered the bulwark of the Constitution, the most important amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Amendment number 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject to this for the same offense. Um, for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Amendment number 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Amendment 7. In suits at common law, when the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Amendment 8. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Amendment 9. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Those are the 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights. I want to point out, first of all, how many times it says thou shalt not, basically. Shalt not, the government shalt not, or shall not. I didn't actually count how many, but I hope you noticed how many times, nor shall private property be taken. Shall not be construed to deny, shall not be infringed, etc. I mean, this is very biblical sort of language. The 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, right? Well, thou shalt not take the guns away from the people. It's the same sort of authoritative, direct, straightforward language. And our founding fathers wanted this written, wanted everyone to know about it, so that they knew what their rights were, so that they knew what their government could not do. Our government cannot establish a religion, for example, and make everyone subscribe to this religion. They cannot say, everyone shall be Methodist, or everyone will be Catholic, or whatever. That's incompatible with the First Amendment. They can also not take away the guns from the people. That's something they cannot do. No matter how many false flag shootings they pull up, no matter how many children they put in front of a camera crying, it doesn't matter. This is a right, a God-given right. You cannot disarm people, period. The only exception to that is if they forfeit their own rights by infringing upon the rights of others. Then specific individuals can have that right forfeited. But the people? Well, what does the document say? That their right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, period. And so on and so forth. This is very direct. Again, it's almost biblical language, with the shall nots. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, right? That's what the Lord said. Well, thou shalt not haul someone into a court without presenting the evidence, witnesses that are opposing him. You can't do it without a warrant. Thou shalt not do it. So again, this sort of biblical language, a very authoritative language, was used to delineate our rights, or at least some of the rights. Notice in what the Ninth Amendment said. It basically says anything that we might have missed, that we didn't include here, well, the people still retain these rights. So Amendment number 9 is pretty cool. I like that one. It's just kind of a catch-all. Well, if we miss something important, well, we didn't actually miss it because this amendment protects it too. And then the 10th almost backs up the 9th and says, yeah, anything we didn't say, well, the states, they have that say, not the federal government. And then it clarifies that even further. Okay, not just the states, but the people. Because all authority comes back to the people. At least in our system of government. In most places in the world, that's not true. Most places in the world, they have a ruling clique, some sort of despotic government, or they claim they have a democracy, which actually means whatever ruling party's in charge, that the people vote in, that's actually who rules, not the people. So our system is the only one that's based on this rule of law. Law, that's an incredibly important concept. Liberty without law is nothing. There has to be law. Rule of law, law and order. Without it, it's anarchy. It's mobocracy. It's chaos. No one's rights could be secure in a system that does not have rule of law. Rule of law basically means 99% of the people want to take this guy's life. Well, doesn't matter. They don't have a right to do that because this person has a right to life. Unless he forfeits it, of course. So it doesn't matter. 99.9999999 infinity of the people could want to do this or that, and it doesn't matter if you have a rule of law. It does not matter if you have a rule of law. Just let's get that through our heads. Let's kind of repeat that as a mantra. It doesn't matter. The whims of the people are irrelevant. Law is what is important. And the people, our forefathers, they supported a system of rule of law based on the individual rights that all people everywhere on the earth have. These are equal individual rights that no government anywhere can ever take away. No people on earth can take away. Now, sure, they can do it, but when they do so, they come out in open rebellion against God and against all morality and all justice. So they can't justly do it, let's say that. Now, so these are the two kind of foundational sets of tens. You have the Ten Commandments, which regulates our moral behavior, our conduct with our fellow man, and also tells us not to do certain things that we would consider political, such as thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, right? Or shalt not kill, but it actually meant murder. The word actually implies a premeditated state of things. Anyhow, and so that regulates human relations one with another, and sets up our relationship with God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The second set of tens, set up by the founding fathers, and kind of based on that first set of tens, the Ten Commandments, are the 10 Amendments of the Bill of Rights, which is the kind of the crowning jewel of the U.S. Constitution, which was in turn connected to the Declaration of Independence, which declared that we have our rights from God. So these are God-given rights. And this document, this Constitution with its amendments, protect those God-given rights. Now, so those are the foundations for civil society. So we should probably then study what is in opposition to those. What is opposing this state of affairs? What is trying to tear down the civilized order that's maintained society for thousands of years? What is assaulting the whole notion of the Ten Commandments? What is trying to tear down the Bill of Rights and take away our God-given rights? The chief philosophy in the world that is assaulting the character of man, that is assaulting his God-given liberty and rights, that is assaulting the notion of the family and of sanity and of truth, and that is denying the origin of man as a child of God. The number one greatest philosophy in the world is communism. Or you could call it socialism if you want, whatever, there's no difference. It's the same exact principles are in play between socialism and communism. The only difference is whether we're going to shoot you in the head and take over the government, or whether we're going to trick you, lie to you, and then take over the government through getting your vote. There's no difference at all. The result upon your rights are the same. Your rights are curtailed and taken away. The results on your wealth are the same under socialism or communism. It's stripped from you and redistributed to other people. It's plundered. The result on the family is the exact same under socialism, communism. The family is shunted to the side. Parents are told they're not important anymore. Children are told to worship the state. The state's going to take care of them. Cradle to grave, right? So socialism, communism, they're identical. They're two peas in a pod. It's the same thing. No difference whatsoever. And so the whole world, there's not one government on planet Earth that is not a socialistic government. That's a bold statement perhaps to make, but it's true. I defy anyone to find one that's not. Israel, they're very communistic. It's a very ruthless regime. England, I mean, you have to just be not even paying attention to think that they're anything but a socialist government. The Fabian socialists, they set up camp in England. They took over the country. Germany, same thing. They're a socialist government. Karl Marx, he came from Germany. Russia, of course, is the head honcho on the communist pyramid. China, have you ever bothered to read their constitution? I have. It openly says, hey, we're a socialist government. We want more socialism, and we're going to be led by the Communist Party of China. Okay, it says that right in there. Go read the preamble of the Chinese constitution. In India, there's another seventh of the world's population right there. They have a socialistic government. If you bother to do any historical research at all, you'll see that the KGB heavily infiltrated India. You go all over throughout the world, Latin America. There's not one country there that's not a socialist country. What about the United States? Because didn't I say every country is a socialist country? Yes, because even in the United States, even though our Constitution specifically refutes the entire notion of socialism, well, we've been indoctrinated to think that what we're doing is actually capitalism, to what we're doing is actually in accord with what our founding fathers set up. In truth, what we've done, especially in the last 100 years, but it started back before the Civil War, intensified under Lincoln, who centralized the government and destroyed the Constitution, and just has been a downhill slide since then. In 1913, it got another, a kick further down the road when the Federal Reserve was set up. The 16th and 17th Amendments were instituted. And it's just been one, and then you have the FDR's 4 terms of communist rule, essentially, in this country. It's just been downhill, straight downhill for 180 years. And so if you look at it today in our policies, not what we say, not the rhetoric, but if you look at our policies are communistic. We have instituted all 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, without one exception. Now, there are a couple that perhaps not as fully as the communists would like, but all 10 of them are there. And so the average American who supports these sorts of ideas, whether he or she knows it, realizes it, acknowledges it, he or she is a communist in his principles. I once wrote an article years back for the Independent American Party called "You Might Be a Communist If... .. And then I went through the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto and gave examples and said, well, if you support this is in accord with Marx's manifesto, so therefore on this point you are a communist. And so the average person in America is a communist. Again, not by title. They would reject the title. In fact, most of them would even reject the lighter socialist title. Though people like Bernie Sanders, who is an openly avowed socialist, and that, what's her name, Cortez, who's running right now, she's an open Marxist. So you have people like that that are gaining in popularity. If you look at the polls, people are more and more are saying that capitalism's failed, we need socialism as an alternative. So it's rising. And to me, that's the big story of 2016, not Donald Trump's election. To me, that was somewhat irrelevant. The real big story was the fact that the open and avowed socialists were this close to obtaining the nomination for the Democratic Party. See, the Republicans and Democrats are both socialists and always have been, at least in all of our lives. No one living has ever seen a day when the Republicans and Democrats weren't socialists. Yet they do it in a concealed way. They'll use other terms like progressive or liberal, or they'll, neoconservative, neocon. They'll use all these various terms, or they'll disguise the fact and use all this patriotic language like George W. Bush did, and to make everyone think he was a sincere conservative Christian, when in fact he's a member of Skull and Bones and a big-time elitist from an insane family. that's hell-bent on establishing, as the former Bush said, a new world order. And yet they hoodwink the people because they use these sort of fluffy sayings and it's egalitarian language. And yet, if you look at their principles, they're socialists or communists. That's just a fact. But today, since at least 2016, they've been openly saying we need socialism, and the people are, especially the younger generations, are saying, "Yeah, that sounds wonderful." I mean, it's just incredible how much support among the younger generations there is for socialism, by name socialism. Now, again, like I said, though, we already have the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto in place. Now, there's been a massive cultural war. Cultural Marxism is almost all but taken over. Yeah, that's kind of the last hurdle, because there are still tens of millions of Americans who have some semblance of sanity. That they love the Constitution still. They might not understand it very well, but at least they love it. They love the idea of it. They love the idea of having a place where they can worship whatever God they want to. The notion of individual rights, private property. So there's still millions of Americans, though they might be off on certain things, they still love the notion of this American tradition of liberty. And so that hurdle has not been overcome by our enemies yet. But it's slowly, or maybe fastly, it's coming to pass. And so I want to read a little bit from the Communist Manifesto about this last set of 10 that we should all be aware of. These 10 planks, 10 principles of communism that are destroying our society. Because if you really look at it, almost everything in our society is backed by communism. Almost everything horrible that's tearing our society. I've talked about this before. I detail it in my 2 books, A Century of Red and Red Gadiantons. But just briefly, you have things like front movements like the feminist movement, the LGBT movement, environmentalist movement, the so-called civil rights movement. All these various movements, Agenda 21, now Agenda 30, 2030. These are all communist fronts. The United Nations itself is a communist front. Every single head of the United Nations has been a communist, without one exception. Sure, some of them call themselves socialists and whatever, but again, socialism, communism, they're the same thing. So it's been a communist front movement, the whole United Nations organization. So this whole apparatus of world government, the New World Order, the globalists that Alex Jones always rants about, it's communism. So if we don't know communism, we're never, ever in a million years going to defeat these enemies of humanity. These global Bolsheviks. We're never, ever going to defeat them, period. Unless we understand what we're up against. Understand their philosophy, what they're trying to do. In most cases, what they've already done. Again, most of these have been instituted here in the United States. They just haven't openly convinced people that, yes, this is the right way. In socialist Europe, though, they have convinced people, hey, we all need health care and all this sort of crap. Which is, it proves, I mean, that's why Europe is what it is today. A society that's completely fallen apart and overrun by third world immigrants. So, I'll put my rambling aside for a second and read a little bit from the Communist Manifesto, written or at least touched up by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Yeah, this comes from Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is where you kind of find the game plan, the communist game plan. I'm going to read a couple quotes before I actually get to the 10 planks. They write, quote, "The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat." And who's the proletariat? Well, that's a fancy term. That doesn't really mean a whole lot, but it basically means anyone who's on our side, and the term bourgeois essentially means anyone who's against us. Of course, they would give it more technical definitions, but that's essentially what it amounts to. Proletariat is the communists and their supporters and their dupes, the people that they can trick to be on their side. That's the proletariat. The bourgeois is anyone who stands up against that, or anyone who loves private property, anyone who cherishes freedom, anyone who worships God. That's the bourgeois, no matter whether they're poor, rich, or in between. Okay, going back to the manifesto. Another proposal here. Quote, abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. The abolition of the family. Think how insane you have to be to even say that. And yet, we have millions of people in our society today that are parroting these same sorts of talking points, the feminists and the LGBT community. Okay, going on. Quote, the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. So again, like I said, the abolition of property rights of anyone who doesn't belong to their class. So sure, the elite ruling class of communists, they'll own all the property they want. Vladimir Putin, a communist KGB agent, he's one of the wealthiest men in the world. He's a billionaire. And yet these sorts of people talk about love for their people. Instead, they just plunder and pilfer billions and have all these assets and mansions everywhere and they fly all over the world while they chastise us about so-called man-made pollution and all this other stuff. And they're the supreme hypocrites. So moving on again to follow the last point that I was there, he says, quote, in this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in this single sentence, abolition of private property, close quote. Again, abolition of the family, abolition of private property. In other words, if you want to read through the lines there, they're saying abolition of liberty. That's really what it comes down to. Satan, remember, he's at the head. He's the one. He's the one in charge. And so he has given this philosophy, this anti-freedom philosophy, to people that are susceptible to his deceptions, like Karl Marx. Again, okay, here's another quote. Quote, the communists are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. Close quote. To abolish countries and nationalities. So in other words, what they've done in Europe, more or less, with the European Union. Union? Did I say that right? European Union. Anyway, they've more or less abolished the borders. I mean, you just take a train straight across. It doesn't matter. You can travel through anyone's country, visit wherever you want to. They've brought in millions of immigrants from North Africa, the Middle East, all over the place to dilute the cultures that are more homogeneous. Multiculturalism. Multiculturalism, if people are not righteous, if they do not share the same concept of law and liberty, is not a good thing. It's a terrible thing. Now you have somewhere like in America that really was a melting pot. You had a lot of different cultures came together to form the United States. Most of them were European, but you had Irish, you had Germans, you had Scandinavians and Swedes and all sorts of people that came together. These mixed with Spanish, and then you had the blacks from slavery, and they got all mixed in. You have all these various peoples and American Indians and whatnot. And yet America functioned normally and became the greatest superpower in world's history. Why? Because we had the Constitution. We had the second set of 10s there. We all subscribed to it. We said, yes, we believe in this gospel of liberty that is espoused in the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence. And then we also believed, almost everyone in America, for most of our history, has believed in the first set of 10s also, the 10 Commandments. It's only very recently that, the last couple generations, where people have started rejecting the 10 Commandments. It's down, I don't remember the last number I saw, it's in the 70%, maybe a little higher than 70% of people that claim to believe in God. Now this is down a long ways from the beginning. Benjamin Franklin once wrote a little pamphlet to Europe convincing people to move here. And one of the things he used, he said, atheism is almost unknown there. If I'm remembering the quote correctly, that's what he said. Atheism is almost unknown there. He said you could live your whole life and not bump into an atheist in the United States. That was in early America. People were God-fearing Christians. So they were God-fearing Christians who loved liberty and the rule of law. And that's why this nation became great. It didn't matter the different cultures that were here because they all subscribed to the same philosophy of life. However, in somewhere like Europe, where they are decadent and godless, the majority of them are, and where they don't have this notion of rule of law, where they don't love liberty, Well, they might say they do, but let's face it, they don't. They don't understand it whatsoever. And so you have these two sets of tens that have crumbled underneath them. Their whole foundation for civilization is gone. And so when they bring other peoples in who already have a different set of morals and beliefs, values, then the whole thing becomes diluted, and they become a third world hellhole. Let's face it, that's basically what Europe is these days. I was surprised when I moved to Russia. I went there as a missionary, if you weren't aware. I lived there for 2 years. I learned the language. I spent my time walking on the streets and meeting with people in their homes, and so I got to know the real Russia, not the Russia that Westerners see when they come and be wined and dined or visit the fancy business district in Moscow. That's not the real Russia. So anyway, I saw the real Russia, and I was so surprised at how third world it was. Then again, it shouldn't have surprised me, knowing that that was the center of communism. But at the time, it did surprise me. I thought it had to have been more advanced than that, but no, it wasn't. It's just like the rest of Europe, just a decadent hellhole. And so, again, that's because they let the first two sets of tens here crumble, and instead they instituted the last set of tens that I'm talking about, the Communist Manifesto, and its 10 planks in particular. And so I guess I'll go on to that. Here's the immediate few paragraphs right before the 10 planks. Marx and Engels wrote, quote, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the condition of bourgeois production. By means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable." Close quote. And then they go immediately into the 10 planks. I just want to make this one comment really quick, that the Communist plan is very flexible. They apply themselves differently in every country. Ultimately, though, their aim is the same: to abolish private property, to do away with the family, to dissolve nationalities, to kind of centralize the whole world under this international body of communists, New World Order, if you want to call it that. So remember, this is for the most advanced countries. So like the United States, this was specifically written to be applied in places like the United States, Great Britain. So here it is. Plank number 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents and land to public purposes. Number 2. A heavy, progressive, and graduated income tax. Number 3. Abolition of all right of inheritance. Number 4. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Number 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Number 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Number 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Number 8. Equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Number 10. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc. Close quote. I hope as I read those, you were able to tick off in your mind each one of them and see how it's coming to pass. I'm not going to go over all 10 right now, but I will mention a few of them. There's a huge emphasis on free education these days. All public schools in America are subsidized and financed by the federal government. They all receive money from the government. And therefore, the government essentially blackmails them into obeying the sort of curriculum and regulations and bureaucracy that the federal government chooses to enforce upon them, to impose upon them. My dad's a public school teacher. I've worked in public schools in various capacities. I've been around a bit of that. I've seen some of the regulations and some of the ways that the federal government blackmails with money local schools. I mean, theoretically, our local schools are controlled locally by the school boards. In practice, that's not really true. And so this was one of the chief communist goals right here, to take control of public education. Why? So they can indoctrinate the rising generation. It's just as simple as that. If you control the schools, you control what the next generation thinks. And unfortunately, like I said before, most Americans are communists in their principles, and these principles were learned in the public schools. They were mixed with things like Darwinism and environmentalism. There's this jumble of ridiculous jargon that denies man's divine origin as a child of God, and that denigrates the value of what it means to be a person, of our rights, of our potential and destiny. So all this has taken place through this communist principle of free public education. Now, the gradual, number 9 here, it talked about the gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country. That is, the cities and the rural areas. That, if anyone's familiar with Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030, that's what they're talking about there. All these sorts of terms like sustainable development and all that crap, that actually is straight out of Agenda 21, which is the communist blueprint for fulfilling this number 9. And they've been doing that. More and more people have been moving out of the rural areas into the cities. I just saw a thing a couple days ago that said fewer people now are traveling for work, to move to different areas for work, relocating for work. Instead, they're staying put in one area. And one of the reasons for that is there's an emphasis on it. There's indoctrination that's going on, but there's also, economically, it's less feasible to do. And so this is, if you look at the Hunger Games, they had the districts, right? Well, that's the plan for America too. If they get their way, we'll live in these districts, and we won't be able to really move outside the districts. We'd have to have government permission to move outside of our district, our region. And this is what it was like during the Soviet Union era, and today it's also the same in Russia. If you're in Russia and you move from one spot to the next, you have to go get papers giving you permission from the local area there that you can even live there. And if you're gone for a certain amount of time, certain number of days, I forget off the top of my head, 4 days or something, you have to notify the authorities. You can't just up and leave. You can't just move wherever you want to. You have to have permission at every step. This is the type of bureaucratic regulatory regime that the communists always set up. And this sort of thing is being instituted all over Europe too. Number 5 here talked about a national bank that has an exclusive monopoly over the money. Well, the U.S. Constitution places the control of our money in the hands of Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives in particular. In fact, it was one of my ancestors who proposed that bill in the Constitutional Convention. I believe his name was Caleb Strong, if I remember right. Anyhow, that little bit of information, that little principle, has been taken and twisted, and now, instead of allowing the people's house, as it's usually called, to have control over the money, it's now controlled exclusively, a monopoly, by this private Federal Reserve System. And I'll do a future podcast on that because it's very important. They print the money. They do whatever they want. They've openly said, we're not accountable to anyone. And that's how they operate, as if they're above the law, as if they're not accountable. And here's the thing, they're not a federal organization. They're private. privately owned. We don't even know exactly who owns them. Foreigners, as far as we know, own some of the shares. I mean, think how dangerous that is to have foreigners owning, controlling shares in this system that controls our nation's money, that can inflate our currency, print new money. So you just go down the line here. Income tax. Yep, we have that. They're getting rid of rights of inheritance. So that me passing on something to my posterity when I die. Instead, they're taxing it, the so-called death tax. And so if you look, you go down the line, every single one of these things, all 10 of them, all 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto are being implemented here in the United States. All of them. And everywhere else in the world, they've also been implemented. I challenge you, go look it up. If you search, you'll find it's everywhere. So this communist, socialist monstrosity has spread its tentacles over the entire globe. And that's because we have not listened to the first two sets of 10s. We have not followed the 10 Commandments, and we haven't respected the rights as outlined in the 10 Amendments of the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. If we ever want to get rid of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, these Marxist principles that have caused so much havoc, have destroyed the home, that have destroyed our nation's wealth, if we ever want to do that, if we ever want to get rid of that and come back to sanity and restore our republic, we must go back to the foundation that the republic was originally built on, to the 10 Commandments, and then the rights in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And so I hope that I've impressed upon your mind how important it is to know the 3 10s, the 10 Commandments, 10 Amendments in the Bill of Rights, and the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. I mean, I've seen sources that said the Communist Manifesto is the most well-read book, or it's not even a book, most well-read piece of literature in the world. And I don't know if exactly that's true, but I've seen that in a couple different sources, including a book by Robert E. Hales titled Secret Combinations Today, A Voice of Warning. He talks about that in that book, how it's the #1 book in the world. And we know that, as I've emphasized repeatedly, that communism is Satanism. It's the earthly manifestation of Lucifer's plan, Luciferianism. It is a conspiracy. One of the additions to the Communist Manifesto, that was written, I believe it was the introduction to the English edition, off the top of my head. They wrote that communism started as a secret society. And if you trace it back, I've traced it back in a couple of my past podcasts, you can trace the history of communism back to the Illuminati. It was a combination of the Illuminati with, they fused together with certain Jewish elements of conspiracy, and certain sects of Freemasonry. Not all Freemasons are involved, not all Jews are involved. It's not a Jewish conspiracy. It's not necessarily a Freemasonic conspiracy either. It's not even a straight-up Illuminati conspiracy. It's this amalgam of evil. It's a satanic conspiracy. Satan is at the head. So it kind of is pointless to argue whether it was the Jesuits or whether it was the Zionists or the Bilderbergers or the Club of Rome or any of these various councils, the CFR, the Committee of 300, all these other groups. Doesn't matter. They're led by one malevolent entity, Lucifer, Satan, the devil, Beelzebub, Abaddon, Baal, whatever name you want to give him, Satan. He's the one in charge. He's the one pulling the strings. And the Communist Manifesto is kind of the representation of what his philosophy is all about. These 10 planks, along with those other quotes I mentioned about abolishing the family, abolishing property, abolishing nationalities, and consolidating the whole world into under this despotic state. And he actually says they have to make despotic inroads upon our rights. I said it right there. I read the quote to you. They admit it right in the Communist Manifesto. This manifesto is the representation of Satan's plan, his philosophy, which is communism. So our real enemies in the world are the satanic communists. They're the ones in charge. The New World Order, when it comes, is not going to be some vague globalist notion. I really despise the term globalism and globalists, if you haven't gathered that already. It's so vague and absurd that we really do ourselves a disservice by repeating that. The globalists this, the globalists that. Well, who the heck are the globalists? The globalists are communists. The communists are at the head. Period. It's them and their allies, the socialists. And again, there's no difference between socialism and communism. So the communists, I just lump them all together. The communists, this communist philosophy is what is being imposed on the world. These principles I just read, that's what the world is suffering under right now. Communism. When the New World Order comes, it will be communist. I guarantee it. Now, if we ever want to restore our republic, if we ever want to fortify ourselves against this communist threat, we can do it. And actually, it wouldn't be that difficult to do. Theoretically, it's very easy. It requires repentance. It requires us to acknowledge God, repent, keep His commandments, and then to subscribe to His gospel of liberty, which is made known to mankind through the U.S. Constitution, which I testify with all my heart was an inspired document. That's the plan right there. That's how we can restore society. Repent, turn back to God, embrace the rights that are given to us, and defend them with our very lives. John Adams said this, one of my all-time favorite quotes. He said, quote, "The only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue. And if this cannot be inspired into our people in a greater measure than they have it now, they may change their rulers and the forms of government, but they will not obtain a lasting liberty. They will only exchange tyrants and tyrannies." Close quote. And that's what America's done for far too long now. We go from a Democrat to a Republican, back to a Democrat, back to a Republican. We just bounce back and forth. And the elites, this communistic elite, they just sit back and laugh. I mean, that people actually think Donald Trump is going to be the savior. He's not. Sorry, he's not. He's probably been the best president in my lifetime. I'll give him that. There's been a few things he's done that I like. There's been a lot of other things, such as dropping more bombs than Obama did in 8 years already, that I don't like. To me, that's an impeachable offense. But there's no difference between these puppets. Between Obama and the Bushes, Clinton, they're all puppets. They're all puppets of the same shadowy group, this invisible government, as Edward Bernays called it, this communistic regime. This regime that follows these 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. That's their game plan, their blueprint for takeover. It's a red blueprint, the communist blueprint. They're the ones in charge. The only difference with Donald Trump is that he's a puppet who doesn't know he's a puppet. Whereas someone like Obama and Bush, they were knowing puppets. Now, if we ever want to take the power back, the people are supposed to have the power, then we need to do it by reestablishing rule of law, by reestablishing the U.S. Constitution. And we're only really going to be able to do that if we first repent, come to the Lord, and then gain a spirit of discernment that repentance and faithfulness brings. So this was I think, a really fun podcast this week. And I hope that you learned something. I hope that you got something out of it, maybe tied a few things together for you that maybe you had already thought of, but maybe they weren't connected in your mind the way they should be. I hope that you take away that these 3 sets of 10s, really, they govern everything in life. You think about it, the 10 Commandments, they govern our relationship with God and man. The 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights, they guarantee our freedoms, our God-given liberties. And then what is opposed to those? The 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, this Marxist dogma, which is really Satanism in full bodily form. So please understand these principles. Please realize that the satanic communists are at the top of the conspiracy pyramid, and that above them, Lucifer rules. He is the puppet master. If we ever want to serve the true master, though, Jesus Christ, we need to embrace his 10 commandments that he gave. And that we need to embrace the political gospel that he gave through the American founding fathers and the U.S. Constitution. It's just that simple. So please remember the 3 tens. And also remember my little catchphrase that I sign off with every week. Sic semper tyrannis, and long live liberty.